Hi friends, today we're talking Africa and the Commonwealth. Now, Africa is well represented within this grouping because 19 countries on the continent are member states. That amounts to about 2.4 billion people who have experienced British colonialism in some way or another. My name is Christine Mundwa from Zimbabwe, and today I am joined by Wadzanai Motsi, who is also from Zimbabwe. And Wadzanai says Africa should be considering, as a regional bloc, how to leverage relationships, especially with Commonwealth players such as Canada and India, to address the continent's challenges and position Africa as much more or as a much more prominent actor on the global market. And I also have with me Oheneba Boateng from Ghana, and he says that on the Commonwealth that it will still be relevant only on condition that it is used as a platform to address the injustices on colonialism and the current inequalities. We also have Linda Irolo. She is from Nigeria, more controversial today, and she says Africa, or rather the Commonwealth, is a shackle that Africa needs to free itself from. I want to open the floor today with the question of the relevance of the Commonwealth. For Africa, we've just noted that 19 countries are members of this grouping. That's about 2.5 billion people on the African continent. Is it still relevant for the continent, and why? And I'll bring that question to you first, Oheneba.
I think, as my opening statement said, it's still relevant on condition that it's able to solve the problems that member states face. But in principle, I would say it's relevant because when you look at the Charter of the Commonwealth, some of the problems that they want to solve are the same type of problems that African countries are facing. You talk about development, trade deficit, governance issues. So they have principles that address each of these dimensions. But in practice, it looks like the Commonwealth is not meeting these goals, right? So on the condition that it is able to address these problems, it will be relevant. But now it's like an organization that exists to a large extent in principle without affecting the actual policies and improving the lives of the member states.
I want to come to Wadzi at this point, to Wadzanai, because you come from Zimbabwe. This country lost its membership, and we know that the new president has recently applied to have the country rejoin. There seems to be the understanding, at least in the case of Zimbabwe, that there is some kind of an advantage in being a part of this grouping. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think as the example with the other 19 countries, it's not so much about the relevance as the utility, right? It's an association of countries and the opportunities that they can leverage as a bloc and the things that they can advocate for as a bloc is really what makes the Commonwealth useful or not useful. And I think from the Zimbabwean perspective, this is a very clear movement towards re-engaging with the international world and really making it clear that Zimbabwe is open for business again and Zimbabwe is looking to re-engage with the world. But it's also a very clear step to the United Kingdom, I think, and a very clear message about a shift from the Mugabe-era politics that the new President Mnangagwa is trying to take.
Okay, so this might be more of domestic politics than the wide region. But Linda, you are very sort of skeptical, to say the least, about the Commonwealth bloc. Just to repeat your opening statement, you say it's a shackle that African countries need to free themselves from. Elaborate on that for us.
So it's a way for Africa to engage with the global world, yes. But there are several international organizations that Africans are already members to. So far, what is the record of Commonwealth? Right now, I can only think about, the Commonwealth Games, and then there's also the Commonwealth Scholarship. Other than that, there is no other benefit. And I feel that I'd like to reiterate what Professor Lumumba, he made a comment in the National Security Symposium not too long ago. And he said something. He said, if the Commonwealth is supposed to be like a community of free states, then why does it seem like the leader is always hereditary and not rotational? Why is it always, Britain is there, is telling the Africans this is what you have to do and all that. And Africans always feel compelled that they have to listen to their former colonial masters, which is why I feel like this is a shackle. We already have international organizations that African states are part of, and if they want to push to have a position in the global community, use those arenas.
Well, I mean, I'd like to...
Let's
have...
She's encountering. She seems to want to...
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's some very clear benefits of the Commonwealth, and maybe that's changing now in the light of Brexit as the UK moves itself out of the European Union and is looking to other markets to expand its trade. Before, I think the Commonwealth served as a very good platform for the African countries to be able to advocate through the UK to the European Union for agricultural policy, for trade policies that was slightly more favorable to developing or emerging economies. So it was really a place to kind of leverage interests and to be able to advocate for specific policies to be utilized or approached or followed. And as Britain now pivots away from the European Union, this is the question, right? Are they looking just to expand kind of their market? Are they looking to expand opportunities for trade? Or are they really serious about building lasting partnerships with the rest of the world? And that's where I think as the Commonwealth moves forward, Africa needs to be very clear and serious about what it's looking to get out of this organization and what the benefits could be. And leverage that in that conversation with Britain as it moves out of the European Union.
I'm happy you said that the Commonwealth is becoming more relevant now because of the Brexit.
Yeah.
Why wasn't it even more relevant before that? You know, you see them pushing to areas they feel that they would have more power in, because now they're losing the power that they had in the European Union. And with leverage, they have the United Nations General Assembly. And this is where they can also bring things to the table. So why not choose that avenue? That's what I'm saying. I feel like the Commonwealth is just pulling us back for some...
Yeah, I mean, but you remember
we also don't have to forget that the Commonwealth is a voluntary association, right? So states can choose to join and leave, right? Britain, for instance, can choose to leave the organization if they want to, right? So we have to recognize the fact that African countries can choose to leave. Then the question should be, if it's not important to them, if they are not benefiting from them, why are they not leaving? Or why are they not trying to get the organization reformed, right? So given the history of the organization or its origins, I get your point that it's directly linked to that colonial history, and even the structure, the governance structure and the leadership is still linked to that history. But I still recognize that African countries still have the decision, they have the choice whether they want to leave or continue to stay with the organization, you know. So it's not completely a compelling situation for them to continue to stay with the organization if they don't want to be there.
Yeah, I want to bring in the conversation about colonialism, and you alluded to it in your opening statement. You said if we are getting to the point where we are addressing the injustices of that time, it makes this grouping relevant. What do you mean by that?
I mean, I see the Commonwealth as more like a reconciliation platform for former colonial territories and the former colonizing powers to address some of the issues that are now arising, or some of the outstanding issues that we've not been able to deal with from the colonial times, right? You can talk about governance structures that may not be actually helping Africans to develop. You can talk about resource exploitation. You can talk about capital flight from Africa that is actually led by British companies, right? You can talk about African art that are now stuck in British museums that are not being returned to the continent. You can talk about African records that are stuck in British libraries, right? These are critical issues that people, that the countries, the former colonies in the Commonwealth don't seem to talk about. I don't really hear them talking about these things, right? And for me, these are important issues that need to be brought to the platform of the organization, because that is where, it's not even with the UN, but with the Commonwealth, that is where you have a direct engagement with the British, and that is where you can raise these issues, right? And try to solve them before you move on to other stuff. But now it looks like the countries are not talking about it. Britain is not talking about it. And it looks like we seem to have, not that we've forgotten, but we've just disregarded the critical issues that we need to address from our colonial history, and we're just trying to move on to economic development, trade partnerships, democracy, human rights, But all these issues are important, but they still leave a lot of issues that are not being addressed, So for me, if the platform of the Commonwealth is used to address the colonial question, right, and solve any outstanding issues, then I would support the organization that as very relevant. But to me, it's not doing that yet.
And whose onus is it to raise these issues in this platform from your standpoint?
I think it's the African countries. It's our leaders who need to raise these issues. Britain is not going to talk about these issues. Mm-hmm. I was just reading a report of the British Foreign Affairs Committee on the Commonwealth, right? And they were just talking about how they can use the organization to direct some of their engagement from the EU to this organization, how they could benefit from trade with the Commonwealth, how they could give concessional visa policies to Commonwealth students to benefit the British economy. So the British interest in the Commonwealth is very clear, and it's very, very self-interested in that sense, right? Okay. It's not about the greater good of... No, even though the name of the organization is Commonwealth, but...
The wealth is not common.
Exactly. And I understand them because it's an association, it's a voluntary association, so whoever joins must be working in their own interest. So for me, it is the African countries that need to raise these issues if they are interested in addressing some of these historical issues.
Sorry, I really want to comment. So if we want to address colonial issues, my question would be, does the Commonwealth present a good platform? Because the Commonwealth will not be addressing every African colonial issue because it has to address the colonies that were under Britain. So what happens to other African states? And I feel like we can use other avenues to do that without necessarily having the Commonwealth.
Yeah, I want to bring a question to you because you talk about the continent needing to leverage its relationships with members of the Commonwealth. You mentioned here Canada. You talk about India. Talk to us about how the continent could effectively do that, or member states from the continent.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is really like, what are African countries looking to get out of the Commonwealth, right? If it is a question of using this as a platform to kind of discuss those historical injustices and create a clear path to rectifying them, that's more than just niceties, then that's what the African countries need to bring forward as a bloc. There are 19 of them in a 53-member organization, 53 country member organization. There's enough of them that this conversation can be had and can be a productive conversation. I think the same thing applies to trade, it applies to aid, it applies to democracy and governance building. It's for the African countries to really sit down and use their Commonwealth initiative to create an agenda that speaks directly to what they're trying to achieve and what they're hoping to get out of this for each of for the bloc. I think at the moment you have countries that are operating individually and really benefiting from this kind of association of countries. So, for example, South Africa is one. South Africa accounts for over half of all the trade that's done within the Commonwealth, but for African countries, right? South Africa is clearly making significant gains through this partnership, right? But where are the other African countries? Why aren't they being able to get kind of similar shares of trade or that kind of investment into their local economies? That's really a direct reflection of their engagement with the Commonwealth. That's something that needs to be a little bit more strategic, I would argue.
On the advantages, I mean, I'm just thinking if somebody is looking to establish a business, for example, in another country, it helps to go to a country where the language that is spoken is the language you yourself are speaking. We know that English is a common language when it comes to the geography of these countries. These are some of the advantages, Linda, that one would then maybe present and say, amongst other things, if the man on the African street who wants to then broaden his horizons from the continent and access different markets. For example, we can see what's happening with India and IT. We can see some of the same thing with IT happening in the east of the continent. If you have those, parts of the world coming together, merging, can we not see opportunities being created on that front? Or are you saying the structure is we don't need it at all. Just find another way of doing it.
Yeah, my argument is that like the Commonwealth has become an institution that I can't really put my hands on the tangible benefits that it has for African countries. And yeah, the games. And you know, when you talk about education, trade, and all that, you can still achieve that with bilateral agreements, and there is so many of that being signed at the moment. So why not go through those avenues? If, for me, the Commonwealth should remain if it actually creates an avenue where you said colonial issues should be addressed, trade, and all that. But if it's not doing that as an institution, then it should be taken off, and some other strategy should be used to create bilateral relations with countries.
So do you find there's a false sense of security in things like Commonwealth membership, where a nation feels, oh, you know, we're a member of the Commonwealth, and that in itself feels like it's something, but in actual fact, it doesn't translate to anything? I saw you. Oh.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. When we're saying it doesn't translate into anything, I think it's translating into smaller things, right? But I think what we're looking for is kind of the lasting impact that really changes the socioeconomic status of these countries that are part of the organization. In terms of smaller things, so the Commonwealth is working to provide technical support to African countries, a really innovative program that I'm curious to see kind of the outcomes of, is working with governments to develop a hub and spoke system that works on kind of strengthening the export chain within a country. So right from that moment of production, transportation, potentially marketing and diversification of products that are getting to the centers of production and then export, right? And that for me, I think is kind of the beginnings of something more substantive and something more useful for the continent. Countries like Botswana or Namibia, they know they need to diversify kind of their economic base. And so they're using the Commonwealth as a platform to start having those conversations. Similarly, countries in West Africa know that chain of production needs to be improved. And so this is an opportunity to leverage some of that technical support to build these networks. I'm just wary of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, I absolutely agree. I think it is like a colonial relic. It's an association of former British colonies, right? I mean, it very much is a colonial institution, but what are the useful components of it that can be perhaps strengthened or leveraged as this is a body that engages in the international sphere? I think maybe the last point that I want to make is that we spoke briefly about like other platforms that African countries can use to engage. It's important to note that currently the UK is the only member from the Commonwealth that's a part of the UN Security Council, right? And so in terms of kind of providing a voice, this is an avenue that African countries can look to as having a partner in advocacy in specific halls of power. I think the challenge here comes from African countries being very clear about what that give and take should look like, and not being essentially rallied around causes like the Commonwealth kind of used that platform to strengthen support for the SDGs with no concrete benefit or return to African countries. I think that's where that conversation needs to change.
I want to bring in the part about Brexit and the United Kingdom and who is now standing with more of a bargaining chip here. This is a country that is leaving this bloc, the European Union, and should we as African countries step up, or are we not in a position to be able to say to the British, actually, you need us more than we need you?
Well, I mean, Nigeria is saying that, right?
But seriously, I don't think African countries are in the position to leverage anything when it comes to British exit from the EU, because the British are aware that they're not going to get a comparable trade agreement with the Commonwealth as they had with the members of the EU, because trade with Commonwealth countries is very small. The volume of trade among them are very small, right? So it's interesting that they are now being more open and trying to actively engage the Commonwealth countries, but they're also aware that they cannot replace the EU relationship with the Commonwealth because of the volumes of trade involved. And African countries too are aware that they do not have that leverage over the British. So to me, there's maybe trade with British trade with Canada, India, and other huge economies within the Commonwealth would do them a little favor to reduce the burden that they will have to inherit if they exit the EU. But I don't think the Commonwealth can
The
replace
fact that we don't have leverage as African countries, is it a classic case of we just lack the buying power? That, you know, British industry isn't going to make all that much money from African member states as it would, for example, in India. What is it? Is it as simple as that we're still just not on the map economically? That we're a nice to have in terms of you're a guest at the dinner party, but you're not necessarily the VIP. You know, you're not the person who you want to introduce to everybody, but you know, you decorate the room and it's nice to have you there.
Yeah, I think it's more of in terms of the Commonwealth, I think it's more of just being part of a group that has a certain history, right? But when it comes to the actual economics, I think we do not have that leverage. But what we have is the natural resources that the British companies are actually heavily involved in. We saw the report about how they actually control a lot of resources in Africa, and that's what they're interested in, right? Mm-hmm. Apart from that, we do not have the purchasing power for British goods, right? We do not have the manufactured goods that they would also be interested in. So our economic relationship is actually centered around the primary commodities that we provide to them, right? Apart from that, the relationship doesn't go much beyond that. We can talk about.
And Britain's looking for a market, essentially, right? I mean, because it's two-way, right? It's what we're exporting to the UK and the potential of that. But Britain's also looking for a market for their goods as that is shifting and they no longer have the privilege of the EU trading bloc. And so I think in that aspect, there is definitely opportunity for African countries to be able to say, okay, fine, these are the goods and services that we're willing to negotiate on. And these are the ones where you have to build capacity in country and partner with our local businesses to be able to build something more concrete. I think it might be a small pivot, but I think it's a worthwhile one for sure. And
I think you're saying that on the assumption that the African countries would actually work as a bloc, which is a different
Well, that's
issue,
what I was going to come to next, exactly. Because that's part of the weakness of the African agenda within the Commonwealth is that like you mentioned, there are a lot of bilateral agreements, but the countries as a bloc working to consider what are the best interests for the bloc, right? I think that's where the biggest limitation is. And we also need to consider kind of the role of China in this conversation. I think whereas the UK had focused its last 30 years of attention on the European Union and kind of integrating itself into that trading system and that kind of this cultural bloc, essentially, and political structure, China has been growing, India has been growing, Brazil. So there are all these different economic players that now also have interests on the continent. And it's not just a matter of Britain coming in and being able to operate as usual. And so how can Africa also leverage these different relationships to be able to better understand, like, this is what we need from these partners and this is what we're willing to give in return.
Yeah, and I think that's why it would be very difficult for the British to just come in and try to rekindle these old relationships, because for the time that they've been away, in quote, African countries have been developing other, relationships that's in a way seem to be more beneficial, in quote, than the kind of relationship they've had with Britain for the past 60 years, right? So it would be very difficult for the British to expect I don't think they expect African countries to disengage from China and India, but it's going to be very difficult for them to have the kind of impact that they would want to have on the continent.
I want to what extent are African countries still dependent in terms of things like aid, and can we really? I mean, a lot of this also hinges on the aid that flows into African member states that comes from countries like the United Kingdom. Is it irresponsible, Linda, for a country to remove itself from a grouping like the Commonwealth, potentially risking losses in aid? Is it justified? Do you feel we need to take some pain in order to chart ourselves onto a way that's more progressive, as opposed to remaining aid recipients? And I know we've had the aid conversation as Africans. People agree this is not the way to do it. Are you saying rip the bandage off? If it means losing the aid, then you lose it, but then you're steering yourself into a direction where you're being forced to come up with ways of being competitive and competing on that front, and not necessarily from the position of we are helping.
I would say we should get rid of the aid. And that's the narrative right now in Africa. Probably not what we are practicalizing, but we are saying, oh, we want trade and not aid. Mm-hmm. But we're not moving forward with that. We're not just getting aid from the Commonwealth. We're getting aid from China. We're getting aid from the US. We're getting aid from World Bank, IMF, name it. So Africa should get to that point where and another problem that I challenge that we have in Africa is that we really do not know. Let's not talk about Africa and the world like it's like a perfect place. We can't expect the United Kingdom, for instance, to go to the Security Council and talk on our behalf. That will never happen. So we should
check their voting record.
Exactly, that will never happen. So African leaders should take account, take responsibility of the things that they need to do, provide the services that we elected them for. Because you have these leaders that are there for their own pockets, and that's a challenge with leaders enriching themselves every single day. Mm-hmm. And that's the reason why you find them still aligning themselves to the Commonwealth, because at the same time the Commonwealth provides legitimacy, and that's what African leaders are looking for. But if we for some reason in the near future have the kind of leaders, the crop of leaders that Africa really needs, then I would say that we should get rid of these institutions, make our own institutions stronger, reduce the amount of aid that we receive from international organizations and states, and try to build something from within. We can still maintain bilateral relations with the United Kingdom, but not necessarily have this, because the Commonwealth feels like this hierarchical relationship where the Britain is on top and we're just there to listen to them. And that's a relationship that needs to change. And we've been trying to change that for ages now. This is what Nkrumah talked about. We should get rid of the dependency that Africa has. And unfortunately, we are still on that path of dependency, and we need to get rid of it.
Yeah,
maybe we should also be. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I just wanted to add to that. I think as far as aid and development are concerned, I think the Commonwealth has really just been used as a way to gather consensus around members for larger agendas that aren't necessarily reflective of the members' interests. And I mean, in that sense, I absolutely agree. I think there are missed opportunities there for people to have a slightly more critical conversation about what we're really aiming for in terms of development, what the structure of aid should look like in the long term, and how do you reduce that over time, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we should also be careful not to overestimate the amount of aid we get from Britain. Actually, it's actually at the moment it's actually cutting down the amount of aid that it gives to African countries, but it's companies that invest on the continent are benefiting more from the African country. I recently shared with Linda a report about how much resources that British companies control in Africa, over 1 trillion on the continent, right? And and besides that, even to the aid industry generally, for every $10 billion that the continent receives, 14 billion leaves the continent, right? Yeah. So it's actually African.
Deficit.
Yeah, there's a deficit. African countries or the continent in general is giving more to the outside world than it's getting, right? Mm-hmm. So in that sense, we should not. I don't consider the aid gesture as really critical for the development of the continent. What we need is actually decisive leadership that is willing to take the hard decisions, that is going to win us off this kind of unequal relationship.
I'm hearing sentiments from the both of you of lazy politicians, essentially, who are leaning back on these gigantic structures. Oh, okay, misguided. But let's be harsh. Let's be harsh to these people.
But that's really polite.
Let's be in Zimbabwe, this is why we sat with Mugabe for years, because we want to be diplomatic about everything. But the point is, and Mugabe would never have made it in Nigeria. These people in the West Africa, at least, they would have risen up. I'm getting a sense of, these are just easy things for a politician to slip into, be a Commonwealth member, look nice, be in that photo. You want to be in that photo with everybody smiling, all the comments, but it's not helping us develop as a continent. But I'm also hearing from you, Wazi, that there are some benefits that we can exploit. You talked about, initiatives from certain parts of certain countries in the grouping being tried out in other countries. So there are benefits there, but it's the way in which we need to do it is what I'm hearing from you. So I want to bring this discussion to an end. I'm going to ask you to bring me your closing statements. Basically, what you would say would be your last sentence as we wrap up this discussion.
I think for me, it's, again, just reiterating, relevance isn't so much a question. It's about utility and how does Africa leverage this platform if they are choosing to be engaged in this platform. How do you not only leverage your relationship with Britain through the Commonwealth, but also with the other Commonwealth countries. We shouldn't forget there are 50 some odd countries that are also a part of this organization, from Asia through to the Caribbean. And so we really need to be thinking about how to strategically position ourselves in this bloc. And maybe part of that, the solution to that is really moving away that focus from Britain, instead of us as a continent constantly chasing and being asked to kind of have conversations that are strategically useful for the United Kingdom, is really starting that conversation as a block of countries ourselves, and looking at how do we get other Commonwealth countries on our side as well.
Mm-hmm. Oh, before I come to you, I like the point that you made initially. You talked about the fact that, we have to address the inequalities of colonialism. And you mentioned a few things. You talked about things that belong to Africa that are sitting in the United Kingdom, and that needs to be brought back. And I wonder if that's going to be part of your closing statement as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely going to be part. But in general, what to put the bigger picture, what I want to say is that if African countries or African leaders want to reshape the kind of relationship we have with the British and any other major power, we have to raise critical questions, right? We need to be willing to be disruptive. We can't play nice and expect things to change. We need to raise the critical questions, and it involves talking about colonialism, talking about the practices of foreign companies in Africa, talking about all the issues that we talk about in our own countries, but hesitate to raise on international platforms. These are the issues that we need to bring to the international platforms. And I think, so in raising critical questions, that's when we start to address the issues that affect us. If we just want to play nice within the systems, we will live with the same issues and we get nothing solved.
I'll tell you who's not playing nice, and that's Linda. And and we'll come to your closing statements now.
Yeah. We have, we talked about leaders, and we said that some of the leaders are lazy. But at the same time, I must confess that there are still some leaders who have shown a promise. I must say, I am a great admirer of the current Ghanaian president, and I hope it's not all about colored beautiful words now, but he's actually doing something. So I believe that there are still leaders out there who are concerned about Africans who are on the grassroots, people who are actually, suffering, who are poor, and are concerned about them. But I'd like to talk about the issue with the ICC and Africa, and the fact that African leaders came together and came up with this document, a withdrawal document. But in that document, it wasn't about withdrawal. It was about the things they needed to be, they wanted changed in the structure of the ICC.
The International Criminal Court.
Exactly. Yeah. So why not do the same with the Commonwealth? If you really want this institution to be there, to be an avenue to, take for trade, for education, to address colonial issues, why not restructure these institutions? Create some agency for yourself. Have a platform whereby Africa is on a table, bringing its own terms, and not the UK telling us what to do. Come to a table and restructure these institutions to be beneficial to the poorer people, the poorer masses in the communities. So yeah, that's mine.
Yeah. And those are the people that matter most. Those are the people that should be top of mind when all decisions are being made on our continent. So that has been our discussion on Africa and the Commonwealth. As you can see, there is lots to be said. We're also interested in what you think. And so we would encourage and we would ask that you would comment so that we can engage and perhaps even pick up the discussion at some other point. We are all learned, but we can all agree that we can continue to learn more and we can learn from each other. Thank you for watching, everybody.